The dust of forgotten centuries tasted sweet and dry on Ilara's tongue. It rose in a silent, golden cloud as her fingers, delicate yet firm, traced the fractured spine of a 17th-century Florentine Bible. In the hushed sanctuary of her workshop, tucked away in the west wing of the decaying Vance estate, this was her entire world. The scent of aging leather, brittle paper, and acidic glue was the only perfume she knew. Each careful stitch she made with a fine linen thread, each gentle application of wheat starch paste, was a prayer for something broken to be made whole again. At 22, Ilara Vance had become a master of mending the past, a skill that offered no remedy for the slow, inexorable crumbling of her own present. If you want to know how a single night will shatter this fragile piece, watch until the end. I invite you to subscribe to the channel and comment on where you're watching from. We continue. Ilara was a creature of shadows and silence, her movements as measured as the antique metronome that stood motionless on the mantelpiece. Her life was a meticulously curated collection of duties she had not chosen, and responsibilities she could not bear. As the sole restorer of antique books for a family whose only remaining asset was its name, she existed more as a custodian than a daughter. The sprawling Bostonian manor, once a symbol of Vance prestige, was now a mausoleum of faded glory, its grand halls echoing with the ghosts of better times, and the ever-present hum of her father's oxygen machine in the room down the hall. She was a living anachronism, a young woman with old eyes, her spirit bound to the heavy, velvet curtains that blocked out the light of the modern world. Her most fiercely guarded possession was not a rare manuscript or a family heirloom, but her own untouched body. This was not a fortress built of naivete or religious piety, but a shield forged in the fires of observation. She had been a silent witness to her mother's slow erosion within a loveless transactional marriage, a union that had secured the family's name for another generation, at the cost of a woman's soul. From that childhood trauma, Ilara had made a solemn private vow. Intimacy would be an act of profound, mutual love, a sacred exchange of souls, or it would be nothing at all. Her virginity was her one true act of rebellion, the only piece of her identity she had managed to keep pure from the suffocating legacy of her lineage. Yet this shield was also a cage. The quiet dignity of her choice offered little comfort in the long, lonely nights when the great house groaned around her. The vow that protected her soul also isolated it, leaving a hollow ache in her chest that no amount of devotion to her craft could fill. She moved through her days with a quiet grace that many mistook for contentment. But inside, a profound emptiness resonated. She felt like one of the pressed flowers she sometimes found between the pages of old novels, beautifully preserved, but brittle, lifeless, and devoid of fragrance. Her life was a performance of duty, a tribute to a history she felt no connection to, and the weight of this inauthenticity was a constant, crushing presence. The slow decay of the estate was a mirror to a more urgent and terrifying collapse. Her father's health was failing, and the medical debts had accumulated into a mountain of paper that felt far more threatening than any crumbling manuscript. Each letter from a creditor, each final notice tucked discreetly under the mail slot, was a tremor that threatened to bring the entire fragile structure of their existence crashing down. The honor she tried to uphold, the history she worked to preserve, was being appraised and itemized by faceless corporations. The choice to protect her body and soul felt like a selfish luxury when the very roof over their heads was at stake, a moral conviction that was about to be tested by the brutal reality of their ruin. Sometimes she would leave the concentrated light of her workshop and wander the silent corridors of the house. She'd trail her fingers over the dusty surfaces of mahogany tables and gaze at the stern, oil-painted faces of her ancestors. They stared back with cold, judgmental eyes, their portraits a constant reminder of the legacy she was failing to uphold. The overgrown garden outside, once a testament to Vance's prosperity, was now a tangled wilderness, its beauty choked by neglect. Every corner of the house whispered of failure, of a slow surrender to time and circumstance. She was trapped not just within its walls but within its history, a prisoner of a name that had become more of a burden than a blessing. Returning to her workbench, Ilara would pick up the most damaged volume she could find, seeking solace in a problem she knew how to solve. She understood the precise chemistry needed to deacidify paper, the exact tension for a perfect stitch, the patient process of reinforcing a weakened hinge. She could grant a second life to an object that others had deemed lost. But as she held the fragile artifact in her hands, a profound sense of helplessness washed over her. She knew how to mend the broken things of the past, but she was utterly, terrifyingly powerless to stop the breaking of her own future. A storm was coming. She could feel it in the unsettling stillness of the air, and she had nothing to protect her but a promise she was no longer sure she could keep. The city of Boston awoke with a clamor of distant sirens and the rumble of early morning traffic, but within the stone walls of the Vance estate the only sound was the rhythmic, wheezing sigh of the oxygen concentrator in her father's room. Ilara's day began not with sunlight, but with this mechanical breath, a constant, grim reminder of the life she fought to preserve and the debt that was strangling it. She would rise from her modest bed in a room that was perpetually cold, the chill seeping from the single-pane windows that overlooked a garden long surrendered to weeds. Her first act was always the same, a quiet pilgrimage down the hall to check the machine's settings and look in on the frail, sleeping form of her father, his face a pale mask in the dim light. This was her purpose, her prison, a duty performed in the pre-dawn hush before the weight of the day fully descended upon her. Breakfast was a silent, ritualistic affair in the cavernous dining room, a space designed for banquets that now hosted only Ilara and her mother, Beatrice. They sat at opposite ends of a long, mahogany table, the vast, polished surface between them, a tangible representation of the emotional distance they maintained. Beatrice, a woman whose beauty had been preserved in ice, would sip her tea and speak in carefully chosen elliptical phrases about their circumstances. Her words were like smooth, cold stones dropped into a deep well, hinting at the necessity of practical decisions and the sacrifices required to uphold their name. She never looked directly at Ilara when she spoke of these things, instead fixing her gaze on the tarnished silver candlesticks, her reflection staring back, a ghost at her own desolate feast. Every meal was a lesson in unspoken expectation, a subtle conditioning for a future Ilara dreaded. The arrival of the mail was a moment of acute, private anxiety. Ilara made it her duty to retrieve it from the tarnished brass slot before anyone else could. Standing in the cold, marble-floored entryway, she would quickly sort the envelopes, her fingers growing numb as she separated the innocuous circulars from the official-looking letters with their cruel, windowed fronts. Each one, with its bold, red lettering screaming, "Final Notice" or "Past Due," was a small, sharp stab to her heart. She would slip these into the pocket of her apron, a secret cache of shame and fear she carried with her throughout the day. This daily act of interception was her heaviest burden. She was the gatekeeper of their ruin, shielding her parents from the full, terrifying truth, while it slowly consumed her from the inside out. A poison she willingly ingested to spare them. On the rare occasions she had to venture into the city for restoration supplies, the contrast between her world and the one outside was a physical blow. Boston thrived with a vibrant, chaotic energy that felt alien to her. She moved through the crowded streets like a phantom, her simple, modest dress, a stark anomaly against the backdrop of modern fashion and hurried ambition. She would catch glimpses of young women her age, laughing into their phones, their faces bright with a carefree light she couldn't comprehend. A profound and aching sense of alienation would wash over her, a deep longing for a life she felt she had no right to even imagine. These brief excursions served only to reinforce the thickness of the walls around her, reminding her that she was not just isolated within her home, but exiled from her own generation. The pressure took a more formal shape during the weekly calls from Mr. Henderson, the family solicitor for over 40 years. His voice, once a comforting baritone, was now thin and strained with pity. He spoke of leveraging their remaining assets, a phrase that was both a euphemism and a joke, as their only true asset was the house itself, and it was already drowning in liens. "Ilara," he had said one afternoon, his voice heavy with resignation, "your family's name still carries considerable weight in certain circles. It is a form of currency we have yet to spend." The implication hung in the air between them, thick and suffocating. He was not just their lawyer. He was an architect of the gilded cage, gently but firmly reminding her of the one path her ancestors had always taken, a strategic, sacrificial marriage. The solicitor's words would often send her mind spiraling back to a single, searing memory from her childhood. She remembered hiding behind a heavy velvet curtain, watching her mother at the piano. Beatrice wasn't playing. She was just sitting there, her hands resting silently on the keys, her shoulders shaking with sobs that made no sound. Her husband, Ilara's father, had just informed her that her personal inheritance was gone, absorbed by his latest failed business venture. In that moment, Ilara understood the true nature of her parents' union. It was a transaction that had cost her mother everything: her money, her spirit, her voice. This memory was the bedrock of Ilara's vow, a terrifying vision of the future her mother and Mr. Henderson were now inadvertently designing for her. It was a fate she would rather die than endure. This feeling was magnified whenever she walked past the gallery of ancestral portraits. The stern, painted faces of the Vance women stared down at her, their eyes seeming to hold a mixture of judgment and commiseration. They were all there. Her great-grandmother, who married a railroad tycoon to save the family from the Panic of 1893. Her grandmother, whose union with an industrialist funded the West Wing. Each woman was a beautiful, silent martyr, her life a strategic sacrifice for the continuation of the family name. Ilara saw her own reflection in the glass protecting the canvases, her face superimposed over theirs. She was the next in line, the designated offering. The legacy they passed down was not one of honor, but of a recurring, generational sacrifice, a tradition of bartering away daughters to settle the debts of fathers. Even her workshop, once a sanctuary of quiet purpose, began to feel like a cell. The familiar, comforting scent of aging paper and warm glue now seemed cloying, the smell of decay. As she painstakingly re-stitched the spine of a fragile poetry collection, the work felt utterly meaningless. What was the point of mending these inanimate objects, of preserving the thoughts and dreams of people long dead, when her own life was tearing apart at the seams? Her hands, usually so steady and precise, felt clumsy and foreign. The tools of her craft, instruments of healing and restoration, offered no solution for the living, breathing crisis that was suffocating her family. The outside world had finally breached her fortress, and its oppressive weight was crushing the last vestiges of her peace. Beatrice, in her quiet, relentless way, began to orchestrate the solution. She arranged for afternoon tea with the Abernathys and their son, a pale, soft-spoken young man named Arthur, whose only discernible quality was the vastness of his family's fortune. The conversation was a torturous exercise in politeness, a slow, suffocating dance around the unspoken purpose of the visit. Arthur spoke of stock portfolios and yachting with a dull, listless enthusiasm, his eyes occasionally flicking toward Ilara with a look of mild, proprietary interest. She felt like a prized mare being trotted out for a potential buyer, every polite smile a betrayal of the screaming panic in her soul. This was the future being offered to her, a safe, comfortable, and utterly soul-crushing void. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday evening, delivered in a stark, cream-colored envelope from the bank. It wasn't a notice, it was a final, legal decree. The foreclosure auction for the Vance estate was scheduled in 30 days. The paper felt cold and heavy in Ilara's hand, a death sentence for the world she knew. That same night, a call came from her father's doctor, explaining the necessity of a new, experimental treatment not covered by their depleted insurance. The cost was astronomical. The walls were no longer closing in. They had already collapsed. Standing in the darkened grand hallway, the foreclosure notice clutched in her fist, Ilara felt a profound and terrifying calm wash over her. The time for moral preservation was over. All that was left was a choice between annihilation and an unthinkable sacrifice. The name arrived not with a thunderclap, but with the quiet rustle of a legal notice slid under the door. Julian Thorne. Beatrice spoke the name in a hushed, reverent tone, as if mentioning a dark god. He was, she explained, the new holder of their debt. He wasn't old money. He was something new, something far more terrifying. A corporate scavenger who had built an empire on the bones of fallen dynasties like their own. Whispers followed him through the city's most exclusive circles. A man of brutal efficiency and no known weaknesses. A financial phantom who materialized only to acquire or destroy. As Ilara listened, a cold dread, sharp and specific, settled in her heart. This was not a banker or a creditor. He was an architect of ruin, and he had just purchased the blueprints to hers. Days later, a second correspondence arrived. The envelope was not the stark white of a law firm, but a heavy, cream-colored cardstock, bearing a single, embossed T. It was not a demand for payment or a legal threat, but an invitation, or rather a summons. Mr. Thorne requested a meeting at his downtown office to discuss the Vance portfolio. The language was impeccably polite, yet it carried the unyielding force of a royal decree. There was no option to refuse. Elara held the thick paper, its sharp, modern edges a stark contrast to the soft, crumbling pages she spent her days mending. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that this was the precipice. This was where she would have to stand and bargain for the remnants of their lives, facing the man who now owned their past and held their future in his hands. It was Elara who decided to answer the summons. Her father was too frail, and her mother, she knew, would only see the transaction in terms of a social contract she could no longer afford to write. This was a different kind of debt, one that felt deeply personal. She prepared for the meeting as a soldier prepares for a hopeless battle. She chose her simplest gray dress, a garment devoid of any ornament, its high collar a form of armor. She pulled her long hair back into a severe, tight knot at the nape of her neck, erasing any trace of softness. Looking at her reflection in the grand, tarnished mirror of the hallway, she saw not a young woman of 22, but a stern, pale effigy, a ghost already haunting the halls of a house that was no longer truly hers. The taxi ride into the heart of Boston was a disorienting journey through time. She left behind the quiet, decaying elegance of her world and plunged into a maelstrom of glass, steel, and relentless forward motion. The Thorne Tower was the final destination, a blade of obsidian slicing into the sky, so tall and dark it seemed to consume the light around it. It was a monument to a new kind of power, one that was anonymous, absolute, and utterly indifferent to the history it overshadowed. Stepping out of the cab and onto the windswept plaza, Elara felt a profound sense of her own insignificance. She was a fragile, handwritten letter in an age of cold, digital code, a relic about to be appraised by a man who dealt only in futures. The interior of Thorne Enterprises was a silent, minimalist cathedral designed to consecrate power. The floors were vast expanses of polished black marble that reflected the cold, recessed lighting, creating an illusion of walking on dark water. The air was still and cool, carrying the faint, sterile scent of clean glass and expensive electronics. There was no clutter, no sign of human imperfection. Even the art on the walls, enormous abstract canvases of stark lines and muted colors, felt more like assets than expressions of a soul. As Elara waited in a reception area furnished with severe leather and chrome chairs, the oppressive silence amplified the frantic, heavy beating of her own heart. This was a place where emotions came to die, and she had brought hers here to be executed. He entered the conference room without a sound, his presence a sudden drop in the room's temperature. Julian Thorne was not an overtly intimidating man in the way of loud, aggressive tycoons. His power was in his stillness, in the predatory economy of his every movement. He was dressed in a suit so dark it seemed to absorb the light, tailored to a body that was lean and disciplined. His face was a study in handsome, cold neutrality, a mask carved from stone. But his eyes were devastating. They were the gray of a winter sea just before a storm, and as they swept over her, Elara felt herself being catalogued and assessed not as a person, but as a problem to be solved, an object to be valued. The appraisal was swift, clinical, and utterly dismissive. He did not offer her a seat or engage in pleasantries. He moved to the head of a vast, empty table and remained standing, establishing his dominance of the space. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a low, resonant baritone, as devoid of inflection as the polished surfaces around them. He laid out the grim mathematics of her family's ruin with the detached precision of a surgeon discussing a terminal diagnosis. The numbers were staggering, the finality absolute. He paused, his gaze fixed on her. The property, the contents, the name itself. "It is all mine now, Miss Vance," he stated, not as a threat, but as an incontrovertible fact. Elara felt a tremor run through her, but she held her ground, her chin lifted in a silent act of defiance she hadn't known she possessed. As he detailed the cold, hard facts of the acquisition, his gaze kept drifting to her hands, which she held clasped tightly in front of her. He noticed things that others would overlook: the faint bluish stain of ink under her fingernails, the slight calluses on the tips of her fingers, the almost imperceptible tremor she fought to control. These were not the soft manicured hands of a spoiled heiress waiting for a bailout. They were the hands of a worker, a restorer, someone who mended broken things. For the briefest of moments, a flicker of something unreadable, not pity, but a sharp, analytical curiosity, crossed his features. He had anticipated tears, histrionics, perhaps even a desperate, clumsy attempt at seduction. He had not anticipated this quiet, fragile integrity. It was an unexpected variable in his otherwise perfect calculation. Elara, in turn, found herself looking for a flaw in his impenetrable facade. While he spoke of liquidating assets, her eyes caught the faint silver glint of a scar just beside his temple, a flaw in the otherwise perfect marble of his skin. She observed the rigid control in his posture, the way his long fingers rested on the table, perfectly still, yet radiating a tightly coiled tension. She sensed that his emotional unavailability wasn't an affectation of power, but a deeply ingrained defense mechanism. Beneath the layers of wealth and ruthless control, she felt the chilling presence of a profound, cavernous loneliness. It was the desolate emptiness of a man who had conquered the world only to find himself utterly alone in it, and the unwelcome flicker of empathy she felt was as terrifying as her fear. The meeting concluded without a resolution, but something had irrevocably shifted in the air between them. He dismissed her with a curt nod, informing her that his final proposition would be delivered in due course. As Elara walked away from the obsidian tower and back into the living, breathing chaos of the city, she felt strangely altered. The encounter had not broken her. It had sharpened her senses, crystallizing her dread into a single, terrifying focus. She had met the man who held the power of life and death over her family, and she had seen the profound emptiness behind his eyes. This was no longer a simple matter of debt and foreclosure. It was a war of worlds, a deeply personal struggle against a man whose own humanity seemed to be the very first asset he had liquidated. Julian Thorne did not send a letter. He came in person. His car, a low-slung predator of gleaming black steel, was an alien craft parked before the crumbling facade of the Vance estate. It seemed to hum with a silent, aggressive power that made the ancient oaks in the yard tremble. Elara watched from an upstairs window as he emerged, his tailored suit a stark, modern slash against the backdrop of faded grandeur. He did not approach the door with the deference of a guest, but with the quiet, confident stride of a conqueror surveying his new territory. Her home, her sanctuary, was no longer a fortress. It was an asset under inspection, and the new owner had arrived to take inventory of his purchase. She descended the stairs to meet him, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest, knowing this was not a negotiation but a final appraisal of her worth. He requested a tour, and the word felt like a violation. Elara led him through the silent, dusty halls, each footstep of his expensive leather shoes echoing like a gunshot in the hallowed quiet. He moved with a predatory grace, his sharp, intelligent eyes missing nothing, not the water stain on the ceiling of the grand ballroom, nor the faint crack in the marble of the mantelpiece. He was not admiring the history. He was calculating the cost of its decay, mentally itemizing every flaw, every failure. She felt like a curator of a ruined museum, forced to explain the value of artifacts to a man who only understood their price. His presence was an invasive force, a cold, modern wind blowing through the fragile corridors of her life, threatening to extinguish the last embers of its dignity and peace. The tour concluded in her workshop, the one room in the house that was truly hers. The scent of old paper and warm glue hung in the air, a perfume of patient creation. Julian paused here, his gaze sweeping over the tools of her trade, the neat stacks of marbled paper, the presses and scalpels. He ran a long, elegant finger over the spine of a newly restored volume of Keats, his touch both clinical and strangely possessive. For him, it was just an object, another part of the portfolio. For Elara, it was a piece of her soul. To have him stand in the sacred space, his shadow falling across her workbench, felt like the ultimate desecration. He was in the heart of her world, and she knew he had come to claim it, or to destroy it. It was here, surrounded by the quiet ghosts of literature and her patient labor, that he made his proposition. He spoke with no prelude, his voice a low, even timbre that cut through the silence. "The debt is insurmountable," he began, his eyes locking onto hers. "Your father's medical care is expensive. This house is a financial black hole. I will erase it all. I will secure your father's future, and you will retain this house and its contents." He paused, letting the impossible hope bloom in her chest for a single, cruel second before crushing it. "In exchange," he continued, the words dropping like chips of ice into the warm air, "you will give me one night. No emotions, no attachments. A single, private transaction." A wave of vertigo washed over Alara, so intense she had to grip the edge of her workbench to keep from falling. The room, her sanctuary, suddenly felt like a cage, the walls closing in on her. She stared at him, at the handsome, impassive mask of his face, and saw the utter absence of humanity in his eyes. He was not proposing an act of intimacy. He was drafting a contract for the purchase of her soul, using the cold, precise language of a corporate takeover. A primal scream of rage and violation rose in her throat, but it died before it could reach her lips, choked by the terrifying, pragmatic truth of her desperation. The image of her father, frail and gasping for breath, was a shield Julian wielded against her, and it was impenetrable. He did not wait for an answer. He seemed to know that the proposition itself was a poison that needed time to work its way through her system. "You have 48 hours to consider my offer," he said, his voice as final as a judge's gavel. He turned and walked away, his departure as silent and swift as his arrival. The growl of his car's engine faded into the distance, leaving behind a silence that was profoundly altered. It was no longer a silence of peace, but one of contamination. The air in her workshop felt thin and cold, the familiar scent of paper and paste now smelling of decay. He had left his offer hanging in the air like a ghost, a specter that would haunt every corner of her home until she gave him her reply. The following day was a descent into a private hell. Alara tried to lose herself in her work, to find solace in the familiar, meticulous process of mending a broken thing. But her hands, usually so steady, trembled uncontrollably. The fine needle felt clumsy and foreign in her fingers. Every book she touched seemed to mock her. What was the point of preserving the honor of these inanimate objects when she was being forced to sacrifice her own? She abandoned her workshop and wandered the cavernous, empty rooms of the house, each portrait of a Vance ancestor staring down at her with cold, accusatory eyes. They had made their own sacrifices, their strategic marriages preserving the family name. Was this any different? Or was it something far more degrading, a final, soulless transaction in a long line of them? That evening, her mother broached the subject with her usual, maddening obliqueness. Beatrice spoke of Mr. Thorne's generosity and the practical solutions that were sometimes necessary for survival. She did not know the specifics of his offer, but she understood its transactional nature, and she was subtly, insistently, pushing Alara toward it. "Sometimes, my dear," Beatrice said, her gaze fixed on the wilting flowers in a vase, "a woman's greatest asset is her ability to adapt to circumstances. Your father and we made a practical arrangement." The words, meant to be comforting, were a knife to Alara's heart. Her mother, a victim of one gilded cage, was now ushering her daughter into another, one made of cold, hard cash instead of social obligation. The generational curse felt like a tangible, inescapable force. The moral calculus of her dilemma was an exquisite form of torture. She placed her vow, her deeply held belief in the sanctity of intimacy, on one side of a scale. On the other, she placed her father's life, the roof over their heads, the last vestiges of her family's security. The vow, which had once felt like a shield of honor, now seemed like a fragile, selfish luxury. What was the integrity of her body worth when weighed against a man's suffering? The conflict was no longer an abstract moral principle. It was a visceral, tearing sensation in her gut. To say no was to uphold her soul at the cost of her family. To say yes was to save them by shattering the very essence of who she believed herself to be. With a desperate, defiant resolve, Alara decided she could not simply surrender. She had to try to find another way. The next morning, she put on the same severe gray dress and traveled back to the Obsidian Tower, not as a summoned debtor, but as a petitioner with a final, desperate plea. She bypassed the receptionist and took the elevator straight to his floor, her heart hammering against her ribs with a mixture of terror and adrenaline. She found him in his office, a vast, sterile space with a panoramic view of the city he owned. He looked up from his desk, and for a fleeting moment, she saw not cold calculation in his eyes, but a flicker of genuine surprise. He had not expected her to return before the deadline. He had not expected her to fight. "There must be another way," she began, her voice trembling but clear. She stood before his enormous desk, a small, fragile figure against the backdrop of his immense power. "I am a master restorer. My skills are rare. I will work for you for the rest of my life. I will restore every book in your collection. I will dedicate my every waking hour to repaying this debt. Take my labor, take my future, but do not ask for this. Please." Her plea was not just for herself, but for the possibility of a world where not everything had a price, where some things, dignity, honor, the soul, were still held sacred. She was fighting not just for her body, but for her belief in that world. Julian listened, his expression unreadable. He rose from his chair and walked to the window, his back to her. For a long moment he was silent, looking down at the city below. He was not unmoved by her words. He was intrigued by them. He had built his empire on the principle that everyone had a price, that every weakness could be leveraged. Yet this woman was offering him servitude instead of submission, a lifetime of labor to protect a single night of her life. The sheer, irrational power of her conviction was something his logical, cynical mind could not easily process. It was a variable he hadn't accounted for. "Your offer is impractical," he finally said, turning back to face her. "The value of your labor does not equate to the sum of the debt. My terms are unchanged." Defeated, Ilara felt the last of her strength drain away. Tears of frustration and helplessness burned at the back of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She gave him a single, curt nod and turned to leave, her dignity the only thing she had left to cling to. As she passed him, her arm brushed against his, the soft wool of her dress making the briefest contact with the sleeve of his suit. It was nothing, a fleeting accidental touch, yet a jolt of pure, unadulterated electricity shot through them both. It was a shocking, intimate spark in the cold, sterile air of the office. He flinched, pulling his arm back as if he had been burned. His composure momentarily fractured. Ilara froze, her breath catching in her throat, her entire body tingling from the unexpected, terrifying heat of that momentary connection. The journey back to the estate was a blur. The city rushed past the taxi window, but Ilara saw nothing. Her mind was consumed by the memory of that single, electric touch. It had introduced a terrifying new dimension to her torment. Before, Julian Thorne had been a monster, a cold, calculating predator. But in that one, shocking instant, her body had registered him as something else entirely, a man. A deep, dormant part of her, a part she had kept locked away her entire life, had responded to him with a flicker of raw, physical awareness. The dilemma was no longer a simple moral choice between honor and sacrifice. It was now a horrifying battle against her own burgeoning, unwanted desire for the very man who sought to destroy her. Back in his penthouse, Julian stood motionless by the window for a long time after she had gone. He could still feel the phantom sensation of her touch on his arm, a warmth that had somehow penetrated layers of expensive fabric and years of self-imposed emotional isolation. The girl was a complication. He had intended the proposition to be a simple, brutal exercise in power, a way to acquire a unique object and reaffirm his belief that all purity was a commodity. But her defiance, her desperate plea, and now this unexpected physical current between them, had disturbed him profoundly. He felt a raw, possessive urge that went beyond a simple transaction, mingled with an unfamiliar, unwelcome pang of something that felt dangerously close to respect. He was losing control of the narrative, and it infuriated him. The final hours of the deadline ticked away with the slow, rhythmic pulse of her father's oxygen machine. Ilara sat by his bedside in the dim light, watching the shallow rise and fall of his chest. All the complex arguments, the moral debates, the terrifying new desires faded away until only one simple, undeniable truth remained. She loved this frail, flawed man. She loved him enough to walk through fire for him. She loved him enough to sacrifice the part of herself she held most dear. The vow she had made as a child was a promise to herself, but her love for her father was a bond that superseded it. The choice became terrifyingly clear, not as a surrender, but as a final, desperate act of love. Her integrity would not be found in preserving her body, but in sacrificing it for him. She did not call. At precisely 9 o'clock, the moment the 48 hours expired, she presented herself at the private entrance of his penthouse. She had changed into a simple, dark blue dress, her hair unbound and falling over her shoulders. When he opened the door, he found her standing there, her face pale in the cool evening light, her expression a mixture of profound sorrow and unyielding resolve. She did not speak. She did not need to. Her presence was her answer. She met his gaze, and in the depths of her frightened but determined eyes, he saw the full, devastating weight of her sacrifice. The transaction was about to begin, but the air between them was already thick, with something far more complex and dangerous than a simple business deal. He led her not to a bedroom, but to the main living space, a vast cavern of glass and steel suspended over the glittering, indifferent city. The room was a monument to emptiness, furnished with minimalist pieces that looked more like sculptures than invitations to rest. There were no photographs, no clutter, no sign that a human being actually lived here. It was a gallery curated to display power and a profound, chilling isolation. Ilara felt like a ghost who had wandered into a future she couldn't comprehend. Her own warm, breathing fragility, a stark and unwelcome contrast to the cold perfection of her surroundings. She stood in the center of the room, a small, solitary island in an ocean of polished stone, feeling the full, crushing weight of the gilded cage he had built not just for his possessions, but for his own soul. This was where her sacrifice would be made, not in a place of intimacy but in a void. He moved to a sleek, black bar and poured a single glass of amber liquid, the clink of the crystal decanter, the only sound in the oppressive silence. He did not offer her one. The gesture was not one of disrespect, but a cold, clear demarcation. He was the proprietor. She was the acquisition. The terms of their contract hung in the air between them, thick and suffocating. Ilara wrapped her arms around herself, a futile gesture of self-protection against a violation that was already underway. She had crossed the threshold, not just of his home, but of her own moral universe. Every second that passed was another step away from the person she had been, each silent breath an act of transgression. Her vow, the shield she had carried for so long, lay shattered at her feet, and she was utterly, terrifyingly exposed. Her gaze, desperate for an anchor in this alien landscape, fell upon a single object that didn't belong, a small, leather-bound volume of Shakespeare's sonnets resting on a low table. It was old, its spine showing the faint cracks of age she knew so well. Without thinking, she drifted towards it, her fingers tracing the faded gold leaf of the title. "This one is a first edition," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper, yet it seemed to fill the cavernous room. "The leather is drying out. It needs conditioning, or the hinge will split completely." For a fleeting moment, she was not a sacrifice, but a restorer, her professional instinct, a final, flickering ember of her former self. In the sterile world of his, she had found one broken thing, one small piece of the past he had failed to perfectly preserve. Julian watched her, his expression unreadable, his glass held motionless in his hand. He had expected tears, fear, perhaps a desperate, last-minute plea. He had not expected this quiet, professional assessment of a material possession. Her focus on the book, her gentle concern for its decay, was so profoundly out of place in the context of their grim transaction that it momentarily disarmed him. "My father bought it at auction," he said, his voice a low rumble, devoid of its usual sharp edge. He believed beautiful things were the only things worth owning, even as he destroyed them. The admission was a hairline fracture in his marble facade, a small, bitter piece of his past, offered up without his conscious consent, drawn out by the strange, unexpected purity of her focus on mending what was broken. The revelation hung in the air between them, a ghost of a sad, lonely boy who had learned to equate beauty with destruction. Ilara looked up from the book and met his gaze, and for the first time, she saw past the cold, ruthless tycoon. She saw the wound he carried, the deep, internal damage that no amount of wealth could ever hope to mend. An unexpected wave of empathy, sharp and painful, pierced through her fear. He was not a monster. He was just a man who had been broken long ago and had spent his entire life trying to encase the damage in layers of impenetrable power and cold, hard steel. Her sacrifice suddenly felt different, no longer just a violation, but a strange, tragic meeting of two profoundly damaged souls, each trapped in a different kind of ruin. This shared moment of vulnerability altered the very atmosphere of the room. The cold, transactional silence was replaced by a fragile, charged intimacy that was far more dangerous than his initial threat. He set his glass down and crossed the space between them, his movements slow, deliberate, almost hesitant. He was no longer a predator closing in on his prey. He was a man drawn by a force he didn't understand, a moth to a flame that promised not warmth, but incineration. He stopped just before her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He lifted a hand, not to touch her face, but to gently brush a stray strand of hair from her cheek, his fingers trembling almost imperceptibly. The gesture was so tender, so completely at odds with their arrangement, that it shattered her composure completely. A single tear escaped her eye and traced a slow, hot path down her cheek. It was a tear not of fear, but of profound, unbearable sorrow for them both, for the choice she had made, and for the man he had become. He caught the tear with his thumb, his touch feather-light, his expression one of stark, stunned confusion, as if the feel of her grief was a sensation entirely new to him. This was her final act of surrender, a complete and total relinquishing of her armor. She did not flinch or pull away as he lowered his head, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that was not about passion or desire, but about a desperate, searching collision of two worlds. It was a kiss that tasted of loss, of sacrifice, and of the devastating, lonely silence that had defined both of their lives. In that moment, as he held her, the entire foundation of his world crumbled. He had come to this night expecting to take, to conquer, to prove a cynical point about the price of innocence. Instead, he found himself holding the full, staggering weight of her sacrifice in his arms. He felt the silent tremor of her sobs, the profound, selfless grief of her surrender, and it was like a physical blow. The act was no longer a transaction, it was a sacrament of pain, and her purity was not something he was taking, but something she was freely giving to save another. For the first time in his life, the cold, analytical machine of his mind went silent, overwhelmed by a raw, agonizing wave of another person's suffering. It was an empathy so powerful it felt like his own heart was breaking. He felt a savage, unfamiliar urge to protect her, even from himself. This fragile, fierce woman had done the one thing no one else ever had. She had made him feel. The calculated cruelty of his proposition now seemed like the act of a petulant, wounded child, a desperate attempt to prove that the world was as hollow and transactional as his own soul. But she had proven him wrong. In her quiet, devastating surrender, she had shown him a form of love so pure and sacrificial that it made his entire empire of wealth and power feel like a pile of dust. He was not discovering lust or desire. He was discovering the terrifying, world-altering force of another's soul, and the revelation left him utterly undone, adrift in a sea of emotion he had never known existed. As the first light of dawn began to bleed over the city skyline, painting the glass walls of his penthouse in shades of gray and rose, the physical act was long over, but the true climax was just beginning. They lay in the silence, not touching. The vast, empty space of his bed a chasm between them. The contract had been fulfilled, the debt was paid, but the emotional cost was an account that had just been opened, and its balance was terrifyingly high. He looked at her, at the pale, still curve of her back, and felt the profound, irreversible shift within him. He had sought to purchase her virtue, but in doing so he had inadvertently bought his own damnation, and, perhaps, his only chance at salvation. The night was over, but the story of what they had done to each other had only just begun. Ilara did not wait for the sun to fully rise. The transaction was complete, the contract fulfilled, and the silence that fell between them was a heavy, suffocating shroud. Julian, a man who had built an empire on unshakable control, was visibly undone, his movements stiff and uncertain. He finally turned to her, his voice a strained, unfamiliar rasp as he reverted to the only language he knew. "I will have a car take you home," he stated, not looking at her, his words a cold dismissal meant to cauterize the raw, emotional wound that had been opened between them. It was an attempt to frame the night as a simple service rendered, a debt paid. "No," Ilara said, her own voice surprisingly steady. She gathered the simple dress she had arrived in, her dignity the only armor she had left, and walked toward the door. She did not look back as she stepped out of his gilded cage, leaving him alone in a silence that was no longer empty, but haunted by the ghost of her sacrifice. The taxi ride back through the awakening city was a journey through a landscape that no longer felt real. Boston's familiar streets, with their mix of historic brick and modern steel, seemed alien and distorted through the hazy film of her exhaustion and grief. She watched her own reflection in the window, a pale, hollow-eyed stranger superimposed over the blur of morning traffic. The woman staring back was not the same girl who had left the Vance estate the night before. The shield of her virginity was gone, shattered into a million pieces, and she had expected to feel only the shame of its loss. Instead, a complex and agonizing mix of emotions roiled within her. There was violation, yes, but beneath it was the undeniable, terrifying memory of connection, a brief, searing spark of shared humanity in the heart of a cold, calculated bargain. She felt irrevocably broken, yet strangely, terrifyingly alive. Back in the sterile perfection of his penthouse, Julian stood motionless, a statue carved from rage and confusion. The vast, empty space, once a testament to his power and isolation, now felt like a tomb. He could still smell her, a faint, lingering scent of old books and something uniquely feminine that clung to the air, a torment to his senses. He walked to the bar and picked up the crystal glass she had touched, his fingers tracing its rim. With a sudden, violent roar of frustration, he hurled it against the far wall, where it shattered into 1,000 glittering shards. The sound echoed in the silence, a physical manifestation of his own internal fracturing. He had sought to prove a point, to conquer innocence and reaffirm his cynical worldview. Instead, she had invaded his soul, her quiet, devastating sacrifice, planting a seed of feeling in the barren wasteland of his heart, and he hated her for it, with a terrifying, all-consuming intensity. When Ilara stepped back inside the crumbling manor, the air felt thick with a dust of generations, each particle a silent witness to her transgression. The house, her lifelong sanctuary and prison, now felt like a foreign country. She moved silently through the grand, shadowed halls, the portraits of her ancestors seeming to follow her with knowing, commiserating eyes. She had joined their sad, silent procession of women who had bartered themselves for the family's survival. She reached her workshop and closed the door, leaning against it as a wave of profound loneliness washed over her. She was now the keeper of a secret that isolated her completely, a sacrifice she could never share, a wound she would have to carry alone. The very family she had saved was now the one from whom she was most profoundly alienated, separated by the unbridgeable chasm of what she had done in their name. Surrounded by the familiar tools of her trade, Ilara ran her trembling fingers over the smooth, worn handle of a bone folder, the cold steel of a finishing press. These objects had been her refuge, instruments of a patient, meticulous control she no longer possessed. She felt a wave of despair, a sense that her own life was a ruined binding that could never be repaired. Yet as she stood there in the quiet sanctuary of her craft, a different feeling began to stir deep within her, beneath the layers of grief and shame. It was a nascent strength, forged in the fires of her terrible choice. She had walked into the heart of her greatest fear and had not been annihilated. She had faced the most powerful man she had ever known and had, in her own way, undone him. The timid, sheltered girl was gone, burned away in the crucible of that night, and in her place stood a woman who now understood the devastating, resilient power of a broken heart. Julian attempted to exorcise her ghost with the cold, hard rituals of his empire. He threw himself into his work with a savage, desperate energy, his decisions in the boardroom more ruthless, his commands to his subordinates more clipped and brutal than ever. He orchestrated a hostile takeover of a rival corporation before lunch, his mind a razor-sharp instrument of financial warfare, seeking to obliterate the memory of her softness with the familiar calculus of power and profit. Yet, her image persisted. He would be staring at market projections on a screen and see the vulnerable curve of her neck. He would be listening to a report from his legal team and hear the echo of her quiet, trembling voice. The world he had built, a fortress of numbers and assets, offered no defense against the memory of a single tear he had caught on his thumb. He was a king trapped in a castle whose walls had been breached by a single, unarmed girl. The official confirmation arrived the next day in a crisp, cream-colored envelope. A letter from Thorne's legal counsel, written in cold, impersonal language, stated that all outstanding debts held against the Vance estate had been resolved. Beatrice read it with a quiet, triumphant sigh, her face a mask of practiced composure that did not quite conceal the flicker of relief in her eyes. She placed the letter on the hall table without a word to Alara, but her subsequent glance was a heavy, complex thing, a silent acknowledgement of the transaction, a chilling expression of gratitude that was also a form of dismissal. Alara's father, unaware of the true cost, simply seemed to breathe easier, the oppressive weight of impending ruin lifted from his frail shoulders. Her sacrifice was accepted as a necessary, unspoken solution, and their silent complicity was a more profound judgment than any spoken condemnation, leaving her utterly alone with the true price of their freedom. Sleep became a battleground. Alara would drift into an exhausted slumber only to find herself back in the penthouse, suspended high above the glittering, indifferent city. Her dreams were not of the physical act, which was a merciful blur, but of the moments of devastating intimacy that preceded it. The way he had looked at the old book of sonnets, the flicker of pain in his eyes when he spoke of his father, the shocking tenderness of his hand on her face. She would wake up with a gasp, her body drenched in a cold sweat, the phantom sensation of his lips on hers a searing, undeniable memory. The most terrifying realization came in these pre-dawn hours. A part of her missed him. Not the cold, predatory millionaire, but the wounded man she had glimpsed beneath the armor. This unwanted, treacherous feeling was a deeper violation than anything he had done to her, a sign that the night had forged a bond that transcended their grim contract. Julian, in his own private hell, sought a cruder form of exorcism. He broke his long-standing rule of emotional detachment and summoned a woman to his penthouse, a beautiful, willing socialite who knew the rules of his world. He had hoped that a meaningless physical encounter would overwrite the memory of Alara, reducing her to just another transaction. But the effort was a catastrophic failure. The woman's practiced touch felt abrasive. Her expensive perfume was cloying and wrong, her presence an intrusion in a space that now felt sacred in its desolation. All he could see was Alara's wide, terrified eyes. All he could feel was the memory of her fragile surrender. He ended the evening with a cold, abrupt cruelty that left the woman stunned, and left him staring out at the city lights, more profoundly alone than ever. The quiet bookmender had ruined him for anyone else, branding his soul with a purity he could no longer bear to profane. In the late hours of the night, Alara sat at her workbench, a single perfect sheet of vellum laid before her. Her hand, surprisingly steady, dipped a fine-nibbed pen into a pot of sepia ink. She began to write, not to him, but for herself. She wrote of the paradox of her new existence, of feeling both destroyed and forged anew. She wrote of the profound sadness she had seen in his eyes, a loneliness that mirrored her own. She filled the page with the unspoken truths of that night, not as a victim's testimony, but as a historian's record of a collision of two worlds. When she was finished, she read the words aloud to the silent, listening room. Then, with a quiet, resolute finality, she held the paper to a candle's flame. She watched as her confession, her grief, and her strange, unwanted connection to him curled into black ash and disappeared. It was an act of restoration, a painful but necessary mending of her own broken narrative. Months bled into one another, carrying the last of winter's chill with them and coaxing a tentative, fragile green from the neglected gardens of the Vance estate. Alara moved through this slow resurrection of the seasons as a changed woman. The hollowed-out grief had not disappeared. but it had settled deep within her, transforming into a quiet, resilient strength. Her father's health was stable, the looming threat of ruin had vanished, and the house had settled back into its familiar, groaning peace. Yet the silence was different now. It was no longer the silence of a prison, but of a sanctuary she had purchased at an impossible price. She found a strange, melancholy solace in her work, her hands moving with a newfound certainty. She had walked through the fire and emerged not unscathed but forged into something new, something stronger than she had ever imagined herself to be. The world outside no longer seemed as menacing. She had already faced its darkest, most powerful prince and had survived. One crisp spring afternoon, a courier's van, as out of place as Julian's sleek black car had once been, rumbled up the gravel driveway. It delivered a single, square package, wrapped in simple brown paper and tied with twine. It bore no corporate logo, no return address, only her name, written in a bold, elegant script that made her heart stop. It was his. She stood in the grand, dusty entryway, the box feeling both impossibly heavy and dangerously light in her hands. A primal urge to refuse it, to hurl it back into the world from which it came, warred with a deep, undeniable curiosity. It was a ghost from a night she had tried to bury, an unwelcome intrusion into the fragile peace she was so painstakingly constructing. Taking a deep, steadying breath, she carried the package to her workshop, the one place where she still felt like the master of her own fate, and placed it on her workbench like an unexploded bomb. With trembling fingers, she unwrapped the paper. Inside, nestled in a bed of black velvet, was the first edition of Shakespeare's sonnets she had seen in his penthouse. For a moment she felt a surge of rage, thinking it a cruel memento of her humiliation. But then she looked closer. The dry, cracking leather she had noted with professional concern was gone. The spine had been exquisitely restored, the original tooling perfectly matched, the leather conditioned to a supple, healthy sheen. The weakened hinge was now strong and flexible. It was the work of a master craftsman, an act of preservation that was both meticulous and incredibly expensive. Tucked just inside the cover was a single heavy card of the same cream stock he had used for his summons. On it, in that same familiar script, were only 3 words: "For the restorer." The breath left her body in a ragged, painful gasp, the simple acknowledgement hitting her with the force of a physical blow. The restored book was not a gift, it was a confession. It was a silent, eloquent admission that he had seen her, truly seen her, beyond the terms of their brutal contract. He had not seen a victim or a commodity, but a craftsman, a healer of broken things. Elara sank into her chair, her fingers tracing the newly mended spine, feeling the seamless transition between the old leather and the new. She understood with a sudden, shocking clarity that the book was a metaphor. He was not just returning an object. He was showing her that he, too, had recognized something broken within himself that night. The act of commissioning this repair was an act of penance, an attempt to honor the one person who had seen the damage beneath his empire of cold, hard steel. It was his way of saying that she had mended something in him, even as he had shattered something in her. It was the most profound apology he was capable of giving. A wave of catharsis, so intense it was almost unbearable, washed over her. Tears she hadn't known she still possessed began to fall, not tears of grief, but of a complex, aching release. The gesture did not erase the pain or the violation, but it fundamentally altered the narrative she had written for herself. That night had not just been about loss, it had been about a devastating, undeniable connection. He had taken from her, but she had given him something in return, a glimpse of a world where things could be mended, where value was not measured in dollars but in care. Holding the beautiful, whole object in her hands, she felt a flicker of hope ignite in the desolate landscape of her heart. If this broken book could be made strong and beautiful again, then perhaps so could she. The future remained a vast, terrifying unknown, but for the first time since that night, it felt like it could once again be hers to write. She found a place of honor for the sonnets on the shelf above her workbench, where the afternoon light would catch the faint glimmer of the restored gold leaf. It was not a trophy of her survival or a painful reminder of her sacrifice, but a testament to the strange, resilient nature of the human heart. The house was quiet, But it was a living silence now, filled not with the ghosts of the past, but with the quiet promise of a future waiting to be built. She picked up a needle and thread, her hands perfectly steady, and returned to the patient, meticulous work she loved. She was a restorer, and her most important project was now herself. If this story of two broken souls has moved you, and you wish to follow their journey to see if they can truly find a way to heal, let us know your thoughts. We invite you to subscribe, like, and share this story, and to comment on what you hope the future holds for them.